Hi everyone. In this video, we are going to look at the evidence for Noah's flood. This is a worldwide flood that the Bible speaks about, and it shapes much of the reality that we have today. And we're going to look at the evidence that is there for this great event that is mentioned in the Bible. Before we look at the evidence for it, let's first understand what the Bible says about the flood, what exactly happened. The Bible says that God created man and woman on the earth. It was very good, but at the same time, man and woman rebelled against God, and then people multiplied on the earth as they had children. And then things started getting bad because people turned away from God. And at that time, people were supposed to live according to their conscience. God gave them a chance to do what is right, because we all have an awareness of what is right and wrong. But man chose to disobey his conscience, and thus the earth was filled with violence. So the world had got converted to a violent anarchy, and God decided that He would destroy the world. So there was one family or one person who found grace in the eyes of God, and that was Noah. So Noah was there along with his wife, and then he had 3 sons and their wives. So these 8 people found grace in the sight of God. And God told Noah that he is going to bring a flood into this world. And so Noah has to build a boat, a large ship that will hold him, as well as a pair of every major category of animal that would be there on the earth. So Noah and his family went about building the ship. They also spoke to other people, telling them that this is the judgment of God that is coming in the form of a flood. And in order to be safe or to escape from this flood, you need to enter this boat. But most people, in fact, all people other than Noah's family, rejected this message and refused to listen to him. But eventually the day came when the animals also entered the ark. The animals approached the place. So Noah, his family, and the animals entered the ark that he had made. God shut the door, and then it started raining. The Bible says that the fountains of the great deep were broken up, which means there were cracks in the earth's crust. And we know that beneath the surface of the earth, there is lava, there is magma, so that would have come up. Sometimes steam and ash also come out of volcanoes, and all these things would have come out of the earth's surface. Perhaps the word fountains of the great deep suggests that there was a large amount of subterranean water that was there at that time under the earth's crust, and it all came out. It also says that the windows of heaven were open, so there was a lot of rain. There must have been some disturbances in the earth's crust. There might have been shifting of plates in such a way that the water levels rose, and within a few days, the whole earth was inundated. The boat or the ark that Noah had made lifted from the ground, and it was floating in the flood waters. So this was a global catastrophe. The Bible makes it very clear that the whole earth was flooded, and even the tops of the mountains were covered with water. But as time passed, and all the people died, all the animals died, God started bringing changes to make the flood waters recede. So again, there must have been some movement in the plates of the earth's crust. The ocean basins sank, and so the water could go there. And so the flood waters receded from the higher parts of the land or the higher altitudes and went down to the ocean basins. And that's how we have the oceans, the deep oceans that are there today. So after spending about a year in the ark, Noah and his family and all the animals were able to come out. And the Bible says that Noah took a pair of every a sample of every clean animal and sacrificed it to the Lord. Now, at that time, God spoke to Noah again. One of the things that God said is that the rainbow would be a symbol of God's promise to not flood the whole earth again. So, although we have local floods today, we don't have any global flood because God has promised that it would not happen again. We have the first mention of seasons. At this time, God told Noah that seed time and harvest, summer and winter are going to continue as long as the earth stands. So that has prompted people to think, students of the Bible to think, that perhaps it was during the time of Noah's flood that the axis of the earth got tilted. Anyway, there were a lot of environmental changes. The new world, the post-Diluvian world, would be less luxuriant. It would be less conducive to the survival of big animals like dinosaurs and other big members of different species. It would also be a place where there are a lot of the crust is fractured. The crust is fractured and broken into pieces. So now the earth would be prone to volcanoes. The earth would be prone to earthquakes. The earth also evidently lost some of the protection that it had against harmful rays from the sun. So today, if you're overexposed to the sun, you can even get cancer. So these kind of changes took place in the Earth's environment. A less luxuriant Earth meant that there wasn't enough grass, so there wasn't enough plant material or herbivorous food to feed all the people and the animals. So here in the Bible, we have the first time that eating meat is sanctioned. Another thing that we see is that the lifespans that are recorded in the Bible show a sharp decrease after the flood. So there perhaps were environmental changes. There were also genetic changes in human beings, and the lifespans after the flood were much shorter. An interesting consequence of this is that Noah and his sons must have outlived many of their grandchildren or great-grandchildren. So they must have got this reputation as being immortals. You know, the people who are powerful, the people who started the human race, the people who came from another world, the people who are immortals, the people who saved the world that existed in the past. So Noah and his sons and his daughters would have gradually, over the course of time, been elevated to a god or a goddess status. And we see that in the midst of many ancient civilizations. God also tells Noah that from now on, if anyone sheds the blood of man, it is man's duty to punish that person, to shed his blood. So here we have a hint of government, of law enforcement, of judiciary, and so on. There's no mention of government in the Bible before the flood. So these are some changes that took place, and this was how a new life started after the flood. Now we look at some of the evidence that is there for Noah's flood. So first, let's look at the geological evidence. What do you expect to see on planet Earth if a worldwide flood like this took place? Now here we must understand that secular scientists do not believe that there was a worldwide flood or any such catastrophe in the past. So they look at the same features of the Earth, and they have a uniformitarian or gradualistic kind of explanations for these features. But as we will now see, you can look at these same features and they make perfect sense in the light of the flood. This is a pair of a mountain peak in Sydney called the Three Sisters. So these are these three formations are referred to as the Three Sisters, just on the west of Sydney in Australia. So this is a beautiful place that attracts tourists. And perhaps we won't recognize it at first sight, but formations like this or landscapes like this are evidence for a big flood. Okay, in what way do landscapes like this suggest that there was a flood? One of the things that are seen in this region is sandstone and various other kinds of sedimentary layers. Now, even secular geologists agree that sandstone and other types of sediments are deposited by water. Not always, but water is one of the frequent causes for it. Normally, what geologists would believe was that it must be a slow process. I mean, if so many layers were deposited, it must have taken a long time for a little water. But here, if you think of Noah's flood, it was a lot of water flowing in little time, and it could do the same job. This map shows some of the sandstone layers, the deposits that are there in this region. So you find that there are huge amounts of sandstone, huge amounts of similar layers spread across huge territory. So that suggests a massive single action of water. In sandstone layers, when you have these lines that cross over, marks that cross over, that is considered to be a sign of water in action. So this cross bedding also suggests that the sandstone was deposited by water, and the scale of the formation suggests that a huge wall or a huge amount of water was involved. So you can imagine the flood waters rising or the flood waters entering this place and depositing these huge amounts of material in the form of sedimentary layers. And then we have these deep valleys and gorges. After the flood peaked, the rain stopped, and the ocean basin sank, then you can imagine the huge gradient that would be there and the huge flow of flood waters. As the huge amount of flood waters that are filling this place would have receded, there would have been a tremendous momentum, and they would have cut away large portions of weaker rock. And so they would have gone away carrying that material with them. And thus we would have these steep valleys and gorges. So grotesque, stark kind of formations that are very large, spread out over a huge area, they suggest massive flooding. This is the Grand Canyon in America. And here again, we have a similar pattern to be seen. We have so many different layers of sediments, and geologists have given different names to these layers. And conventional geology would say that these layers were deposited slowly and slowly and slowly over millions and millions of years. Okay, but that's because that kind of explanation comes because secular geology does not admit that there was a flood like this. So the only other option is it has to be deposited slowly over a long period of time. But nobody was there to do experiments or take observations for millions of years. So these are not things that are observed, they are speculated. It makes good sense to think that all of this material was deposited during Noah's flood. Some of the fossil trackways that are found in the sandstone layers have gathered attention. And here we see that there have been scientists who have done research on them and come to the conclusion that these marks were made by animals walking in water and trying to climb up. That is, in other words, trying to escape from the water. So that is again evidence of flooding. Now, cross beds are formed, as I mentioned earlier, by water flowing over sand. And you see the same kind of cross bedding in the Grand Canyon as well. Again, this is evidence that these layers were deposited by water. The scale of it shows the amount of water or the amount of flooding that must have been responsible. And again, you see the stark valleys and gorges, and that tells you the force of the receding flood waters. As the waters receded, they carried away a lot of material which they would have deposited at some, maybe in the ocean or at some lower altitude, and that's why we are left with these features. You see this Colorado River that flows through the Grand Canyon, a tiny river. And do you really think that this huge canyon was formed by this small river, doing its little bit of erosion, bit by bit over millions of years? I mean, do you think that this whole formation was formed by wind blowing for millions of years and slowly carving out these rocks. No, that's not how it happened. It is far more plausible to conclude that, well, if there was a worldwide flood, this is the kind of topological structure that we would expect in the world. And the Grand Canyon is not the only canyon in the world. There are many such places on the earth, many different kinds of formation, which are testimony to the flood. These are folded mountains, and you have these layers of extremely hard rock that have been folded, and they've been folded at extremely sharp angles, and they have not broken. How can you take hard rock and bend it in such a way that it bends without breaking? Well, this evidently happened when the rock was just solidifying. These rocks would have been produced because of volcanic eruptions, or they must have undergone some heat and pressure, and so they were folded. But this evidently happened when the rocks were still soft, and that's why they have folded in this way without breaking. So this shows that these layers were not deposited over millions of years. It all happened very quickly, and while the rock material was still hot and soft and partially molten, it was folded. And that's why we have these fold mountains all over the world. Inside the earth, we have huge deposits of oil, huge deposits of coal, and natural gas. And geologists agree that these were formed by plant and animal matter. So these the plants and animals that died long ago, they got converted, they underwent processes involving large amount of heat and high pressure, and then it got converted to oil and natural gas deposits. Now, the conventional geological theory states that these animals died in the water gradually, and over millions of years, these things were developed. But now we know that it's possible to produce coal or oil in a short period of time if the right conditions of heat and pressure are available. We also know that if when animals just die in the water, they don't get fossilized. They are eaten by scavenging organisms. An animal will only get fossilized and buried in this way if it is buried suddenly without oxygen. So this suggests that there has been some massive flooding which would have produced these deposits of coal, oil, and natural gas. Now let's look into paleontological evidence, that is fossils. The most obvious paleontological evidence for Noah's flood consists of fossils. The conventional understanding of the formation of fossils was that an animal would die and then it would remain on the ground, and slowly over a long period of time it would get buried, and then over millions of years a fossil would form. But it is now known that fossils do not take a very long time to form. They can be formed in a few hundreds of years. Fossilized food items have been found from the Middle Ages. And so it is now known that in order to form a fossil, what is needed is sudden burial of the organism. If an animal dies, it is not usually fossilized because it is eaten up by scavenging organisms. But what you expect in a catastrophic flood, such as Noah's flood, there would be a sudden burial of animals and plants, and this would be buried without oxygen, and that would form fossils, and that is exactly what to expect from a big flood. So all across the world, we find fossils, and these are nothing but the relic of Noah's flood. Now, the conventional geological explanation for fossils is that these are animals that died gradually over millions of years, and they got buried for some reason, and then the layers upon layers of sediments were deposited, and this took millions of years. But look at this. Here is the fossil of a tree trunk, and it protrudes through many layers. Here's another similar picture. This would not happen if these layers took millions of years to deposit, because by then the tree would have rotted away. and it would not get fossilized. The fact that this tree trunk has got fossilized this way suggests that these layers were deposited suddenly, that is over a short period of time. And again, that is what we expect in Noah's flood. Look at this fossil of a bird. Its neck is arched behind, and that shows that it died out of lack of oxygen. Water went inside. So this bird had a watery death. This is what happens when a bird or an animal drowns. And it's not common for large birds to drown in the water and then get suddenly buried so that it can get fossilized. By chance, if a bird had a watery death, it would have been eaten by the aquatic scavengers that are there. You have a fish that evidently died while it was eating another fish. So this shows that its death was sudden. It was a catastrophic event that led to the death of this fish. So when we look at the fossils, we find that they did not die in their old age in peace, in a slow process. The death seems to have been violent. Another strange characteristic is that you have these huge graveyards where you have large number of animals fossilized together. Now, if there is, if there are dinosaurs that are roaming around, and one dinosaur among the group becomes old, and so it dies, there is no reason why all the other dinosaurs should also die on the same spot. But the fact that we find these graveyards suggests that these dinosaurs had a catastrophic death. These huge animals were all drowned. They all got drowned together by a rushing torrent of water. And here the researchers who are reporting on this, they say it contains both skeletons from embryos and adults, and they were likely killed in a series of catastrophic mudslides. Amazingly, not only bones have been preserved, but also some soft tissue on a number of the fossils. The conventional geologic theory of how fossils forms does not expect soft tissue to be fossilized. But that is a natural thing to expect in Noah's flood. Since the burial happens suddenly, even soft body parts can be preserved. Now, here we have these secular researchers who don't believe in Noah's flood, agreeing that these were likely killed in a series of catastrophic mudslides. But that is exactly what you expect in Noah's flood. Here is another fossil graveyard in which monkey, bat, and crocodile fossils were found all together in a place in the Dominican Republic. So you have these fossil graveyards all over the world. You have animals of different types, huge animals, and large numbers of them fossilized together. This suggests catastrophic events. Another interesting phenomenon that we see in the living world is the fact that some animals just look like their fossil cousins, or supposedly their fossil ancestors. So crocodiles, tuatara lizards, these are mollusks, and this is a horseshoe crab. They all look like their ancestors who are fossilized more than 100 million years ago. In the case of the mollusk, it's 500 million. But each of these supposedly has not evolved for more than 100 million years. On the other hand, there are other animals that changed from reptiles to people during 100 million years. But these reptiles or these animals did not have to change at all. Does this sound a credible explanation? I mean, is it not far more credible to understand that these are not the fossilized cousins that we see of these animals? They are not ancestors that are millions of years old. They are just cousins who died a few thousand years ago. And that's why these animals haven't changed much. There was a researcher called Mary Schweitzer who found soft tissue of dinosaurs. And this was surprising for geologists because they did not expect that soft dinosaur tissue would survive for millions of years. Some of the tissue is unfossilized, bits of genetic material were found. There were some cells. These are bone growth cells that are there. So remnants of biological material were found, which were not expected to survive for millions of years. Now, because of this, there were so many. The geological community immediately reacted, saying that perhaps there was some contamination, perhaps there is something wrong in these findings, and these are not original dinosaur unfossilized tissue. But later on, it was found that indeed it is. And so now secular geologists believe that that cells and other material from the body of a dinosaur, they now believe that it can survive for millions of years. Well, as far as we know, when we look at the degradation of proteins and other genetic and other biological material, it does not look as if they could survive for millions of years. In fact, there is a paper written by a scientist who tried to measure the decay of DNA in bone. So they were not able to come to any clear conclusion, but they said that the decay rates depend on the conditions. But nevertheless, it seems like the decay timeframes are in terms of thousands of years rather than millions of years. Now, according to evolutionary theory, the dinosaurs got extinct suddenly 65 million years ago. Well, we are suggesting that they got extinct suddenly in a worldwide flood that took place just 4,500 years ago. Now let's look at some anthropological evidence for Noah's flood. This is the Gilgamesh epic, which is a story recorded on a tablet, a clay tablet that is found in Nineveh. So Nineveh is the site of the Assyrian civilization. And even before that, there was the Sumerian civilization that flourished in that area. So it's modern day Iraq. And it records a conversation between two people called Gilgamesh and Utnapishtim. And the text narrates, it's written from Utnapishtim's point of view. And he says that the gods decided to bring a great flood on the earth. And then one of the gods leaked the news to him and told him to make a ship and make every creature to embark on it. And then he did that. He got his family to construct this boat, and then the flood came. The animals entered the ark. It started raining. The flood came. And then afterwards, the rain stopped. And then the ark landed on a mountain. And then he put out a raven and then a dove. And then when the dove the dove first returned to him, and then afterwards he released the animals and made sacrifices. So now this account is very similar to the biblical account. Now, what do you expect if there indeed was a worldwide flood, and if people belonging to all civilizations or all ethnic groups are descended from that family that survived the flood? What do you expect? They would have some legend or some memory of the flood. No doubt, legends tend to get embellished over time, but the fact would remain that there would be legends. That is exactly what we find. So this is the Sumerian flood legend. This is Manu. That's an Indian figure from Indian mythology. So you have him as the progenitor of the human race, and there is a god who comes in the form of a fish, an incarnation of a fish, and tells Manu that there's a flood going to come. And so Manu again builds a boat, and then he is saved. And again, there are 8 people on the boat. In China, we have the story of, again, the 8 immortals who survived the great flood that deluged, that flooded the whole earth. And one of the characters among these 8 immortals is Nuwa. And in Chinese mythology, Nuwa is a female figure, but Noah seems to be derived from the name Noah that's there in the Bible. And the story goes that when the water was falling from heaven, Noah fix the heavens. She stopped the rain from coming by blocking the hole that was there, by plugging the leak. She blocked that hole in the heavens with colored stones. And that reminds us of the rainbow that God told Noah was a promise that he wouldn't flood the world again. So it turns out that all across the world, we have flood legends which parallel the biblical account. Now, these are different elements in the biblical flood story, and then these are the myths from different civilizations. And you find that there are so many common elements, and there are some of these myths parallel the biblical account so well. No doubt some of them have embellishments, some of them have different details, but the ubiquitous nature of these myths suggests that yes, such an event actually took place, and these are the distant memories that people have of them. The Bible gives us the names of the sons and the grandsons of Noah, and it tells us that it is through these people that the world was repopulated. They initially tried to hang around together, but then God confused their languages, and so because of that, they were forced to migrate to different places. Now, when they migrated, the people who, their descendants, gave names to the places that they went to based on their ancestors. So based on that, we get a rough idea as to where these people spread out. Now, for example, the Welsh people have an ancient myth or a tradition that states that they landed on the British Isles 300 years after the flood, and they were descendants of Gomer. Now, Gomer is one of the descendants, the grandsons of Noah. And the Welsh language used to be called as Gomerag, which is again based on their ancestor, that is Gomer. Then Josephus, the Jewish historian, tells us that the place that is called Gaul, that is what we today call France, it was populated by the descendants of Gomer. So from here we can understand that the descendants of Gomer went to Western Europe. Ashkenaz is the Hebrew word for Germany. So it's like the Hebrews knew that there was one group of people, the descendants of Ashkenaz, that went and inhabited in what we now know to be Germany, and they just kept that name, just stuck. And even today, Ashkenaz in Hebrew means Germany. Meshech is similar to Moscow. Tubal, Meshech is one of the grandsons of Noah, so is Tubal. And according to ancient sources like Josephus and people from the other civilizations, these people migrated in the northern direction. And today there is a city called Tobolsk. This is in Georgia. That was one of the former states in the USSR. And there is a river there called Tobol also. So these landmarks, ancient landmarks, are evidently named after the ancestor of the people who settled there, that is Tubal. Togarma seems to have a connection with Turkey. Then Kittim in the Bible means Rome. Javan is the Hebrew word for Greek. Even in Sanskrit, that is the ancient language of India, Yavanas means the Greek people. Aram is the Syrian term for Syria, and Aram was a descendant of Shem, that is one of the sons of Noah. Canaan was the ancient name of the land of Israel, Palestine. And Canaan was one of the sons of Ham, that is a grandson of Noah. Joktan is a descendant of Shem, and the Arabs have an ancient tradition that some of their tribes are descended from Joktan. Similarly, we have the Saba or Sheba. It's one of the tribes in one of the Arabian tribes who can be linked to Sheba, who's one of the descendants of Shem. Cush is the Hebrew word for Ethiopia. And the Bible says that Cush went down south, and Cush was one of the grandsons of Noah. Even today, the Egyptian name of Egypt is Mitzrayim, and the first king of Egypt is supposedly called Menes. And according to the Bible, Mitzrayim is one of the grandsons of Noah who went and founded the nation of Egypt. The One of the sons of Japheth was Madai. In Hebrew, so that's a Hebrew word, and in Greek, or a westernized version of that, is the Medes, who were allies of the Persians. The Persians have a tradition that they are descended from Elam. So Elam and the Medes, or the Kurds, they were together, close to each other, the Persian race. Nimrod was one of the sons of Ham, that is a grandson of Noah, and he founded some of the cities in the Middle East, and his name is still associated with some of these cities. So you see here a trend that the ancestors, or the descendants of Noah, who later on became the ancestors of people who settled in different places, they gave their names to landmarks, and those landmarks or those traditions still exist today. And that suggests that the record of Noah, the flood, and his descendants in the Bible is authentic. If you look at the population growth in the world, after the year 1900, there was a spike in the growth rate. That is evidently because of the successes of modern medicine and vaccination. But before that, the growth rate was between 0.4 and 0.6%. That was the growth rate of human population. It might have been a little less or a little more in the centuries before recording was done. But fundamentally, there was not much that changed in human existence over the centuries before the advent of modern medicine. And so we can expect that the growth rate was more or less constant. Now, if you go with the biblical data and try to correlate it with what we know now, in the year 1900, the population of the world was 1.65 billion. According to the Bible, after Noah came out of the ark, there were only 8 people. And the time span between 1900 and the year of the flood is approximately 4,300 years. So if you do the calculations, it turns out that based on these assumptions, the growth rate of the human race is 0.5%, the annual population growth rate. And that fits with the data that is there as the measurements have been carried out. On the other hand, if you deny Noah's flood, which is what the atheists and those who believe in evolution will do. So according to their scenario, there were many people living when Homo sapiens was formed. So I'm assuming only 2 here, but there were actually many Homo sapiens who evolved out of apes. And then this happened around 0.1 million years ago. The exact date is not known. Now, if we assume a rate that is significantly less than the current population growth rate, then you get a population of 10 raised to 43, which means even if you make this further less, like 0.01%, you will still get a huge number. Now, the current population of the world is less than 10 raised to 10. That is 1 with 10 zeros, whereas this is 1 with 43 zeros. This is a huge, unrealistic, and actually an absurd value. So the biblical account of Noah's flood and the repopulation of the world, it fits in with the data that we have today. But that is not true about the theory of evolution. It's also interesting to look at the origin of civilizations. I mean, you must have come across news that says that this pottery or this artifact was found in this place and it has been dated to 10,000 BC or 20,000 BC. These dates are based on unreliable methods of dating, and they don't agree with historical accounts that are given by the people of the civilization themselves. So if you look into these historical accounts, now in the case of Babylon, there are various historians and they all give similar dates for the origin or the founding of Babylon. Now, for example, Simplicius was a historian who was reporting on Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great conquered Babylon in 331 BC, and the Babylonians gave Alexander and his Greek officials all the astronomical records that they had, because they were very much interested in tracking these stars and planets. So those records extended to 1903 years since the time that Babylon was founded. So accordingly, we get a date. And other historians, these are ancient historians, give similar dates. Now, the interesting thing is, this is just shortly after the Bible says there was a flood and there was a dispersion after that. Tyre was the ancient city in Lebanon, a trading city. That's shown here. The ruins are shown here. And Herodotus, the Greek historian, father of history, says that Tyre was founded about 2000 BC. So that would be 2 or 3 centuries after the flood and after the dispersion. So again, that makes sense in the light of the Bible. Tyre's first king was supposedly Agenor, who is the son of Poseidon. And in the Bible, Sidon is one of the great grandsons of Noah. And Poseidon is a god in the Canaanite and the Greek mythology. But it's evident that he is based on the character of Sidon. And Sidon's son evidently founded Tyre and became the first king there. So we have a similar picture in Egypt. So based on the history of Egypt, which is given, based on actual historical records, the history goes to around 2242 BC. And then similarly, we have Greece. We have the history of Greece, which is also reported. And so you find that in the case of Egypt, in the case of Babylon and Greece, they are all founded shortly after 2 big events in the Bible. That is the flood and then the Tower of Babel, where God dispersed the people. Now, against Tower of Babel, the name of Manetho is there. That's the Egyptian historian, because the Egyptians had a tradition that the Tower of Babel incident happened when Peleg was 5 years old. The Bible says that during the days of Peleg, the earth or the world was divided. That is, the people were scattered. And based on chronological information in the Bible, the birth date of Peleg can be calculated. So it makes sense that after the flood and after God confused the languages and forced the people to disperse, we had the founding of different civilizations. And the civilizations that are located close to Babel were founded shortly after the dispersion, and the civilizations that were a little further away were founded afterwards. So this is anthropological evidence that the flood really took place and the events unfolded as given in the Bible. We hope you enjoyed this video, and we strongly encourage you to look at the world from the point of view of this catastrophe, Noah's flood. We are all descended from the same family. At a time like this, when racism has come to the fore, the Bible offers a unique solution, that we are all made in the image of God. We are all descended from the same parents, and God has a redemption plan that is applicable for all of us. So we hope this encourages you to think in terms of the Bible being authentic. Thank you very much.